right, Dr. Page here. So, I love talking about how trauma, mental, physical, spiritual, or environmental, negatively impacts our nervous system and how we can reset our nervous system for optimal performance. And so when we talk about that trauma response, we have the sympathetic nervous system state. So it's our fight, flight, freezy one. That's the high beta brainwave. That's the overthinking. That's all of the negative outcomes when it comes to being out on the field or on the course. And you don't want to be stuck in sympathetic nervous system state. Then we got the parasympathetic, which is the lower end of the nervous system. So that's our rest and recovery, where we can get full sleep, where we can recover from a hard training day, where we can recover from games, where we can recover from sports injuries, right? But we want to really talk about the alpha, so that in the middle state, right? So that's our flow state. That's our optimal performance. That's our ability to have flexible emotions up and down and having them move through us and being mindful of them and not being stuck in these negative trauma response states. So when we talk about, though, staying stuck in a trauma response, so super common for individuals and sometimes, even more common in males, not always though, we get stuck in these trauma responses and they're out of survival, right? So if you had a really critical parent or a really critical coach at a very young age, moving on in your life, you always had critical coaches, or you always had ones that were always pushing you down to come back harder, that kind of concept in sports. What begins to happen is you stay stuck in one of these trauma responses. So we look at fight. And so with the fight trauma response is a really common one with athletes, because you can stay here, you can be aggressive, you're intense, you're intimidating your competition. And really, if we look at combat sports, of course, it's like, yeah, staying in that state can actually be slightly beneficial. Not completely beneficial, though, because we're still forcing our nervous system to perform, right? We don't have full range of motion. We have that muscle guarding going on from the whole trauma memory network of past negative experiences that have occurred. We've got high adrenaline, high cortisol, high inflammation. We're not sleeping well. We're not getting that full recovery. We're staying sore past the 72 hours, right? Delayed onset muscle soreness. And then also we can kind of start to just be angry all the time, right? So I like to look at hockey as a good example, because there's an actual component of fighting within hockey, right? So you get into that state where you're really angry and you're just trying to force things, and you get really frustrated with someone on the ice saying negative things to you. And so you actually fight, right? Well, over time, staying in this fight trauma response starts to look like some tendencies where we talk about narcissism. So manipulation tactics and having not great interpersonal relationships with your boyfriend or girlfriend. So kind of being controlling, kind of being jealous, trying to manipulate the situation to keep yourself safe. And so it starts to look like that you're looking at like this complex PTSD, borderline narcissist looking thing here, where, yeah, domestic violence can occur, where when you're drinking and you get to a certain point, a certain number of drinks, and you actually become violent and get into a bar fight, or you do get into a fist fight with your significant other, which is absolutely never okay to assault anybody. I get during the sports, yes, combat sports, playing hockey. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes your coach is pissed, and you get pulled off the ice, and you caused your team a penalty that the other team could win, right? Or especially in sports where fighting isn't okay, when it's like football or soccer or something, and the heat is on and the pressure, and you get into it with someone, and that can cost you thousands of dollars, or even cost you your contract, or not getting picked up the next year by a team, or getting let go from your team because they're like, hey, they're a wild card. We don't want them out there. They're loose cannon, right? That kind of stuff. Well, that fight response is a really common one. But physiologically, it's not good to be there. Even though you might think that you're performing aggressively and into it, it's not really what's happening. Because we know subconsciously the body is less flexible. We're more in that fighter stance. We're more in that torsion. And so you're more susceptible to getting hurt. Then when we look at, and like I said, it could be serious consequences when you're not within the sport. If you do lose your temper at the bar, or you do lose your temper out just randomly somewhere, or even road rage kind of stuff, we hear about this stuff all the time. But the freeze state that's where we start to get into issues like the yips. Or just throwing wild, or the passes you were able to make earlier in your career, whether it be high school or college. You're getting into the majors and you can't even throw. You can't even get your body to throw. That's going to be like a dorsal vagal collapse, complete disassociation, disconnection, and frozen state. And mentally, this starts to look like just not really caring about your sport anymore, not having that excitement to go out and play, and it's not joyful anymore. It's not exciting. It's not fun. So you start to kind of get in this frozen state, and you're not as reactive, and your reaction time is very slowed. Like when I look at QEEG brain scans with my athletes from the pre and the post of doing the alpha printing and reprocessing the trauma and desensitizing and ramping the nervous system right where it needs to be, we're back in the alpha flow state. I would often see that the frozen state, people's reaction time was way slowed. Of course, the fight, it was slowed a little as well, even though it didn't feel like it was if you're aggressive. But the frozen state, your reaction time is very slowed. And we start to see a much greater decrease in voltage in the overall brain. So you're not really using your fine-tuned motor skills, because this is like your reaction time area on the outside of your brain. So you get more limbic brain, so middle of the brain. So you're actually not utilizing your reaction to stimulus and then the execution, which is all here in your brain. So frozen state, not good. And it's also when you see the athlete on the field and they're yelling the play to them and they just can't even comprehend. It's like they're just kind of frozen in time and they can't hear, and it takes them a minute to move, and they're not getting in position quick enough and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be more your frozen state. Then when we start looking at the flight state, it's the same kind of thing in the sense that you're going where you don't need to be on the field, or just all of a sudden your body subconsciously reacted and you ran too far, or you weren't in the pocket or where you needed to be. So that flight, it can actually inhibit you and make you more jittery and unable to focus and get into the where you need to be with that flight state. And I see it a lot of times too when you're looking at individual athletes and their legs are just quivering. Like, you're a swimmer, you're standing up in the block and your legs are shaking. It's like, that's where I'll see more of that flight of just like, oh, I just don't want to be here. This is overwhelming. This is too much for my nervous system. So you kind of get stuck in these states. And also with the frozen one can be like when conflict occurs, you can't even, in your personal life, you can't even respond. You don't even know how you're feeling. You're just completely shut down. And so you start to see these life consequences occurring as well. And then with the flight one, that's where I start to see athletes creating that, should I retire or shouldn't I? So it's that decision to retire that could come earlier than maybe they're actually ready, because they're just feeling like they don't want to be in the limelight anymore. They don't want to have to do this. They don't want to have to keep putting their body through this. They're just not loving it and they're just not feeling it. So that's where I see a lot of that flight. And then with the fawn, okay, so when we are fawning, I see this a lot of times with extreme sports or very specific skilled sports when it comes to like gymnastics, freestyle mogul skiing, snowboard half pipe, anything cheerleading when it comes to the flyers. You start to get into this space of, okay, well, the coach said to do this, so I'm just going to do this, as opposed to just that flow state of the alpha, right? So the coach is like, okay, well, I think you should change this. Okay, so you appease. You're sitting there like, okay, so my takeoff, I'm going to completely change it, even though this isn't normally what I do with my takeoff. And you do it, but the skill is still not executed to your optimal ability. What you have been doing. It happens in every single one of the sports. Like even when we're looking at baseball, when you have a batter and the coach is like, well, I want you to do this, and change this component. And so the baseball player's like, yeah, I don't want the coach to take me out. I got to listen to him. But it feels awkward. It doesn't feel natural. And so when you start to fawn and just do whatever, you're not really intuitively playing and playing for you, because really in the end, no one really cares about you. I mean, your coach will let you go like that. It's all about you and how you feel when you're out there. And so I see a lot of that fawning beginning to occur then. Or even choosing a sport that maybe you didn't like in high school and specializing finally, when we actually start to specialize in high school, that's when it's healthy for the body. But choosing the sport that people are saying you're good at, you're better at than this other sport that maybe you loved. And passion will typically override having to make the choice based off of someone else's perception any day, right? So staying stuck in those trauma responses is never going to be sustainable. They will only lead to a decline in sports performance. So what we do, go all the way back in your history. We go through all the negative things that created that trauma memory network that got you ramped up into that beta wave, into those fight responses. And then we desensitize to the worst case scenario happening when you are competing and what that can look like to calm the nervous system and keep it in alpha flow. And it actually enhances your reaction time because you're no longer in a trauma response or sympathetic nervous system state or high beta wave. So yeah, that is fight, flight, freeze. And those are the examples of staying stuck in a trauma response.